You're listening to Leadership Podcast, a series of short, insightful discussions with experts in the field of volunteer leadership. Brought to you by the OREA Center for Leadership Development. Your interviewer is Elaine LaChapelle.
Well, welcome. We're here at the OREA Leadership Conference in Toronto, and I have managed to grab Jill Birch just shortly after her presentation workshop with our members, and I'm delighted to have her here today. Jill is a researcher, and she's doing specifically some work lately on relational leadership practice and process. She's got a lot of background in both profit and not-for-profit leadership work, and we're happy to have her here today. Today we're going to be talking about leveraging your leadership for success. Welcome, Jill.
Thanks, Elaine. It's great to be here.
Glad you could join us.
Thank you.
I understand, based on the research that you're doing and your experience, that you believe that we need to rethink leadership. Why is that?
I think we need to rethink leadership for three reasons. One of them is I think that the complexity that we're now experiencing in the world with social platforms, with the ubiquitousness of technology, and with the way people are now wanting to contribute and collaborate, signal that the older way of thinking about leadership is outmoded. It's been really very dated, and I think it's getting to the point now where the competitive pressures are such that in order for us to really harness the collective perspectives that we have and really work toward becoming more competitive, we're much better together as opposed to working very individualistically. And the old model of leadership really focuses on the individual and how they interact with various individual people. And the new model of leadership is calling for something much different.
So what's different? What is it? What kind of new model is it that you feel people really need to adopt?
The biggest thing that's different is that leadership really operates within social context of relationships. It really is about understanding the processes with which you and I would relate. And that really is how leadership is accomplished. It's about understanding multiple perspectives. And if you're a formal leader, it's about being able to create unity amongst those perspectives. So hearing them, unifying them, facilitating and coordinating them, and then being in a position where you can really start to harness them. So this is often accomplished through building communities of practice. It's accomplished by really creating better strategies for running meetings. I think a lot of the meetings that we've seen in the day of yore, the person at the head of the table has typically talked for 40 of the 60 minutes.
Yeah.
And no one can get a word in edgewise. And particularly nowadays, if you're an introvert, it's very difficult to be heard in a world of extroverts. And as a formal leader, you need to facilitate those experiences, because each of us now, in the complexity of the world, only has one piece of the puzzle. We only have one. And the work of the formal leader is really to figure out what those pieces are and join them together and create this picture so that you can move ahead faster.
Well, that does sound exciting, but it also sounds a bit muddy, more complicated than maybe a traditional form of leadership. What can somebody do to help better understand it so they can start to incorporate some of those principles?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you can do. One is that you can really become much more self-aware. You want to start thinking about what reflective practices you may want to appreciate. And so as we look at the old way of reflecting, which has really been more holding up what I call the mirror, and I examine myself and try and improve myself, the epiphany for me really came in shattering the mirror. When I was working on the research, that had been my metaphor. And as I started thinking about what relational leadership could look like, the image that came into my mind was a window. Which really spoke to the panorama of perspective. Rather than looking at this mirror and looking at myself and fixing myself, it really was about looking out and getting rid of this fixation on the individual. And so I think the one thing that people want to start with is understanding what their model for themselves is. How are they actually behaving as a leader when they look at themselves? And then putting this different lens on it, of looking at a meeting and maybe being on the ceiling watching the meeting happening. And often we're in the moment. and we're having dialogues and discussions that largely we're controlling, especially if you're at the top of the table as the formal leader. And so if you actually looked down on that table and saw what was going on and began to be uncomfortable with it. And I think this is one of the other notions of how we change as leaders, is understanding where we're uncomfortable and becoming, quite, not to be cliche, but being comfortable with being uncomfortable is one of the hallmarks of this change, right? And, who would want to do that if you didn't have to? But I think the pressures globally are such that many, countries are far ahead of us in the thinking about how people are collaborating and interacting. And I was blown away in Southeast Asia, Australia, the modes that they have of conceptualizing leadership are much, much farther ahead than what we have here in North America. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jill. That's interesting. More of a collaborative leadership role and team. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well,
I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great. I've been speaking with Jill Birch today here at the OREA Leadership Conference, and we've been speaking on leveraging leadership for success. If you want to find out more about Jill or the work she's doing or our topic today, you can reach her at her email, birchjb@rogers.com. So glad you could join us.
You've been listening to Leadership Podcast. To subscribe to this podcast, go to orea.com/leadership.